Thank you very much. Everyone hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Yes, we
Right,
can
okay.
now, Colin.
As I was saying before the technical issues, choosing what to talk about tonight was a bit of an issue because there is already a lot of material out there. And the Hammermen were so immersed in the social and business life of Glasgow over 500 years that it almost could have become a history of Glasgow in itself. So what I've tried to do tonight is to choose ways during the body of the talk of answering why the craft exists, why it's important to Glasgow, and when some of the key events happened. And a couple of people who have asked me some questions: what was its privileges, what was the importance of Premier, and its relationship with the Trades House, the Council, and the Merchants House. So I'll try to do that, and I'll try to do it in a chronological order as far as I can. But do feel free to interrupt and ask questions, although I will pause halfway through. So let's get cracking. Although 1536 was the year that we got our seal of cause from the Archbishop, we'd actually existed for generations before as an association. And it was really about 15, 20 families who did blacksmith metalwork in the area around the Trongate. The Fleshers and a couple of the others had made approaches to the Archbishop. It's important to remember, in the early 1500s, Glasgow was by no means a major city in Scotland. Perth, Stirling, Linlithgow, Dunfermline, Edinburgh all took centre stage as far as royalty and Parliament was concerned, even St Andrews. Glasgow only had a population of 6,000. It only had 7 streets leading off the High Street from the Cathedral down to the Clyde to the Bridgegate. So with that context, incorporation was the city starting to not throw off the shackles of the church organisation, but more size and scale and requirement. So the loose association of 50 blacksmiths petitioned Gavin, Archbishop Gavin Dunbar, and this was in an era when religious upheavals and political upheavals were happening in England. Henry VIII had just beheaded Anne Boleyn. Disease, war, famine, all sorts of issues happened throughout the United Kingdom in those days. And I say United Kingdom, it wasn't really united at that stage. This was the time of the rough wooing and internecine strife. And it would be wrong to think of Scotland or England, for that matter, as closely knit communities. Far from it. News took a long time to travel. And that is possibly why Glasgow was 15, 20 years behind Edinburgh Hammermen in incorporating. But the real issue there is Glasgow was left in the custody of the Archbishop. Royalty hardly ever paid attention. So, Glasgow of that time, no old firm, no James Watt. The university had been founded at the back of the cathedral. Glasgow was still a relatively quiet and genteel place when the Hammermen became incorporated. And that started to create all sorts of importance and precedence, because a few years after the incorporation certificate, the Reformation kicked off. And the Hammermen, because they were quite well organised, as were the Masons and the Wrights, they were able to respond to the call of drums as a signal to defend their cathedral. And although they may well have sympathised with the aims of the Reformation, they certainly weren't going to see the hard work of that cathedral de-roofed and burnt down, as happened in nearly every other cathedral in Scotland. So the Hammermen soon won the respect of their citizens and started to play an important role in what would become Glasgow, the city, as opposed to Glasgow, the backwater. So soon after the Reformation, the town council granted us a charter. Now, the original of that charter can't be found. It is referred to, but it is a lead up to a very important thing that happened in 1605, which was the Letter of Gildry, which is where the Trades House, the Merchants House, and the town council, with the successor of the religious organisations, came together to organise as to how the city would be run responsibility, representations, and voting. And this is an important time to remember, because quite a few things to point out then. There was more than 14 crafts in 1605. The bonnet makers and the dyers were separate. There was a craft called the fishers. And if you look at the Deacon Convener Board in Trades House, you'll see that the first Deacon Convener is actually described as a skipper. So quite a lot has changed. However, the interesting thing, I think, from my point of view, is that letter of Gildrey still has resonance today. And that letter of Gildrey can only be amended by Act of Parliament. And there's been 3 or 4 Acts of Parliament which have made fundamental reform to Town Council, City Council, Regional Council. But the key thing for me is representation of the Deacon Convener and the Lord Dean of Guild on the council remains. And although even in the 1950s, the last time this came before Parliament of any great debate, although many people thought it of as an anachronism, many people in the House were swayed by the representations of 3 or 4 cross-party MPs saying that this had been a constant in the city of Glasgow for 400 years and should remain even as observers ex officio. So seen as an anachronism, but also seen as an important part of the mutual respect the trades, the merchants' house are held within civic and political organisation. So the 14 crafts, as emerged later with a bit of merger and acquisition and fishing disappearing as an important activity in the Clyde, we start to get into the 1600s. The 1600s was quite a quiet period for the crafts. There was steady but unspectacular growth in Glasgow during that time, that the Hammermen had started to emerge as metalwork and innovation became more and more crucial. Elections then were rarely confrontational, certainly of the type we've just seen in America. It was very much a case of cottage industries working with each other, not against each other. But some people wonder why the crafts, the 14 crafts, have survived to this day. In the 1500s and 1600s, the crafts carried privileges. In those days, you only got to vote if you had a certain amount of property or hereditary title. But being a craftsman or a merchant allowed you to trade. And this was in an era before the welfare state. So being able to trade on a subsistence basis to feed your family, survival was important. And these privileges, it must be pointed out, lasted from the early 1500s to almost the mid 1800s. So these were important privileges. So the right to trade, earn a living was important. And what that meant in practical terms was, except for a Thursday, which was market day or a free day, where incomers could trade their wares, that was dictated by James VI. Up till then, and every other day, you had to be a member of a trade. Now, the Hammerman trade emerged as big because the Hammerman skill, metalwork, crossed several disciplines. So, for example, making a saddle, a horse saddle, it would have a metal backbone to the saddle, it would have leather, which fell within the remit of the skinners. There would be other attachments fell within the area, the remit of the wrights. And this is where this concept of precedence and being premier came to be of such great importance, because that dictated which trade or craft regulated that activity. And that possibly explains why the Hammermen asserted their rights, and I suppose socially still do. That is why these rights became so important and ended up not just at the letter of Gildrey being in dispute, but being settled in the Court of Session in 1777. So if we move into the 1700s, a big thing happened around 1700. Obviously in 1707, the Union commenced, and that meant Scotland had access to the North American colonies. And because of its location, the sheltered Clyde was a good 5, 6, maybe 2-3 weeks sail ahead of the more established merchant ports such as Bristol. And this was important, and that did start to kickstart the Glasgow economy and make Glasgow a bit more international in its outlook and its connections. So through the 1700s, we saw steady growth. The population grew, Glasgow became more important. And that economic growth, despite a few cholera epidemics, typhus, that didn't actually start to come to any considerable stall until the Jacobite uprising came along in the 1740s. Now, I suppose, fortunately, the Hammermen minutes are perhaps missing, because it's been a source of some amusement to some people as to whether Bonnie Prince Charlie was actually admitted to any crafts. Certainly from what we can see at the Hammermen, he certainly wasn't admitted to ourselves, but our minute books for this period are incomplete, unfortunately. So Glasgow's growth continued quite spectacularly until the early 1770s, when, of course, rebellion in America started, and that started to upset trade. Although Glasgow did start to benefit from the copper bottoming of ships to make them faster, the trade simply moved to the Caribbean and India. So Glasgow's economic boom continued. And if you read the minutes of the Hammermen, and Trades House for that matter, during the 1600s, what you can see is a tone of caution, being conservative. Whereas in the 1700s, as the economy grows and advances are made, you start to detect in the minutes confidence emerging, consumerism emerging, sugar, tea, demand, population growth, confidence. So it's quite interesting that the minutes actually reflect the tone and I suppose the atmosphere of what was becoming a city in the true sense. And I suppose that confidence, commercialism, from the Hammermen point of view, I suppose manifests itself in what happened in 1794 when Robert Adams' Trades House opened. Because before that, the Hammermen and the crafts, maybe numbering in these days 100, 150 traders, craftsmen, perhaps with an apprentice, a journeyman, they would be trading daily in the Trongate. They would have meetings occasionally, perhaps fortnightly, monthly, to regulate their members. But these would happen in what was called the Tron Session House, which was a church near the Trongate, and what is euphemistically called the Change House, which is just another phrase for a pub, such as the Black Bull, where Marks and Spencer's now is. And that is why, to this day, we still use the phrase Master Court, because it performed a regulatory or disciplinary function. It would settle disputes between members, and that was important because Glasgow was growing, there was money, but the craft had to also take money, because in those days it was subsistence, survival. There was very little of a welfare state other than the poorhouse or maybe a benefactor. So the trade, the crafts, long before Trades House or Trades Hall came into existence, had the Trades Hospital or the Alms House. And this was located near the top of the High Street in what's called the Drygate, near the cathedral. And this was where the craft met for many years before Trades House opened. And that's an important start of a new era, 1794, particularly for the Hammermen, because the Industrial Revolution really started to kick off then, fueled in no small part by Mr. James Watt, who one Sunday morning walked down the High Street, entered Glasgow Green, and hadn't even got to where Nelson's monument is now before he'd organised in his mind how the separate condenser steam engine would work, making engines far more efficient. So Glasgow really benefited from that. And tonight's not the night to go into the relationship with James Watt, but it is true to say Glasgow really did benefit from the Industrial Revolution. Now, that benefit of the Industrial Revolution also brought about change and the desire for competition. So what we had by 1794, the house meeting, a well-organised craft, professionals, standard of work being important, starting to take an international interest in activities, started to create questions, I suppose. and that how could scale be maintained? It was a monopoly. So round about 1800, you did start to hear the rumblings of the need for reform, and that starts to manifest itself in voting reform and market reform. So before we get into the big reforms of the early 1800s, it's worthwhile me just pointing out the Hammermen covered so many crafts. Goldsmiths were Hammermen, clockmakers were Hammermen. There was a whole series of disciplines fell within the Hammermen. And this idea of regulation and monopoly is important because 300 years after the seal of cause, it was still the case, other than a Thursday, market day, to trade in Glasgow, in most disciplines, you had to be a free man. And this idea of free man is threefold. You are free to trade in the city of Glasgow. Now, one might think, because Glasgow didn't extend much west of Queen Street and much north of the cathedral, that's quite small, but it was, in relative terms, very, very big. And these various disciplines became very big with population and access to markets. So the ability to regulate these trades, very, very important. And that led to the big dispute, as mentioned earlier, which was the Court of Session Decree Declarator, and that is still in the Deacon's box. And that basically provides a list of precedents. So the tailors, for example, follow us, and then the maltmen, who by then had established their leader as a visitor. And that's important because that is what brought and generated a lot of wealth to the Hammermen. We hear a phrase used sometimes, old money. Well, certainly by 1794, there was a good deal of old money being built up in the various crafts. But in those days, they were also acting as a benevolent organisation, looking after the health of members and what they call in the minutes, decaying members, falling in bad times, who can't work. There's also a very commonly occurring phrase in our minutes, which is pensions paid to widow on account of member taken by tucks. This phrase recurs, and it's a euphemism for commercial travellers in the 17 and 1800s travelling through the Middle East, the spice route, or travellers being taken, lost, missing, abducted. And that was quite a common reason for pensions. And another historical aspect was the need for education. We all recognise it now as a given because it's state-sponsored, a bit like pensions, a bit like benefits. But in the 17 and 1800s, the workhouse was perhaps your only option. The church, potentially, very uncertain. So there was huge, huge maternal benevolence afforded to members and their families. Probably worthwhile, before we pause for a few minutes, questions, how important families are. The rights to trade were largely hereditary, which meant the son of a Hammerman could join at the near hand. And we still use this phrase, near hand, if you have a relative who is a member or was a member. And we have the far hand as a stranger is still a phrase we and a lot of the other crafts still use to, I suppose, recognise an incomer, for want of a better phrase. And that still manifests itself in a small difference in fees, for example. So that hereditary entry or right to trade had a value, and that value didn't start to get lost until the 1820s, when war with France having been settled, reform, civic reform and market reform started, and that would lead us up to the Borough Reform Act, where these privileges were lost. So, Susie, I think we'll pause there and I'll take a couple of questions. Any questions, anybody?
Hi, Colin, it's David here. David. Have you got some particular families that you're going to talk about that were big in the... Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I'll get onto some families in a minute, because after we became a charity, obviously the big issue that gave the Hammermen huge profile, certainly politically, was the shipbuilding industry kicked off big style just after we became a charity, and the Hammermen became the I suppose the port of call for the shipbuilding families like Yarrows, and some of us will know Sir Eric Yarrow, last of Veneer, the Ingalls, the Beardmores. Huge numbers of shipbuilders moved from shallow tidal rivers in the southeast of England, such as Yarrows, who were in Kent, moved up to the Clyde because of its sheltered, and it's only got a tidal range of 2 metres. So I'll come on to the families in a bit. A couple of interesting families just before we get on to the reform was the Craig family. A lot of you will know Charlie Craig, who's on our Master Court. The Craigs have had, I think it's 8 deacons across 13 generations. And one of the Craigs was in business with James Watt. Some people have alluded that James Watt was a member of the Hammermen, or was potentially at odds with the Hammermen, but certainly one of his business partners in the salt market was a Hammerman, James Craig. And it's quite interesting. His elder brother became deacon in the late 1780s, and his brother was the husband of Sweet Clorinda, who most of us who know about Robert Burns know was Nancy McElhoe's. So, and Robert Burns used to drink in the Black Bull, Marks and Spencer's now, and the Black Bull, of course, is where the Hammermen had their Master Court meetings. Before the Trades House. So there's quite a few interesting families, but from my point of view, the more interesting families are after the Borough Reform Act.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Oh, saving it for the end, Colin.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Brilliant.
Fair enough.
I'll share again.
Yes, please do. Yeah, if you go on a couple of slides. Yeah, that was probably fair enough, because we're going to start talking about families. So, Glasgow, not quite uniquely, but certainly rarely, certainly rare in Scotland, rather than become a redundant craft or a redundant organisation when the Borough Reform Act came in, because the Borough Reform Act increased the voting rights by tenfold. So rather than having 6,000 or 7,000 voters in Glasgow, from Cardross to Lanark, you had about 60,000 voters. Still people of property, but set a lower threshold. So the crafts in Glasgow, relatively unique in that rather than just disband and hand over to free market reform or professional bodies that were setting up like IESIS, they actually decided they would continue their charitable causes. And that is why we exist to this day. Certainly we're proud of our heritage, but we're no longer a regulator, for example, of standards of work. We don't have to assess people's work other than through our competitions for students. Members are very much of a social interest, historical interest, networking, still a charity. And all the 14 crafts owe the leadership of the 1820s and 1830s because they decided they would keep their charitable aims. And they were probably quite fortunate compared to other crafts in that Glasgow had made a lot of money as empire. It did have a lot of old money, and that was felt best used for charity rather than just returning the money to the members. And it's probably important to remember that in the 1820s, 1830s, there was maybe only 200 or 300 members of the Hammermen. And the Hammermen were probably, I've not confirmed it completely, were probably one of the bigger crafts, if not the biggest then. The Wrights and the Masons may well have something to say about that. So it was quite forward-looking for an organisation which had been very much a beneficiary of commercialism to revert back to its charitable heritage. And that being said, I suppose the interest starts to come as the shipbuilding industry started to move, and heavy engineering, coal, again, this idea of the Industrial Revolution. Queen Victoria was a bit more hands-off than earlier monarchs, well, perhaps not the madness of King George, but the free market really started to boost the economy, and that drove demand for fuel, ships, locomotives, and the natural home, certainly from a social networking point of view, for these families, the Ingalls, the Connells, the Beardmores, and the Yarrows, was the incorporation of Hammermen. And it almost became, and has, I think we would recognise now, a second lease of life, because Nina and I have spoken to a few other Hammermen organisations in Scotland, some of whom have relaunched themselves, such as Stirling. Edinburgh's very much smaller than we are. Paisley, I have to say, is a reasonable size. But in the main, a lot of them, and I'm thinking of places like Ayr, just shut up shop and gave up. If you look at the Lumsden book, the Gorbals, the barony of the Gorbals, which was a huge industrial centre before it became a relative housing slum, certainly overpopulated, the Gorbals had a big Hammerman operation, which was subsumed into our organisation in the late 1700s. And it's interesting because my forebears, I'm sure we all remember, at our choosing meeting, we are required to recite the legend of the pears, which refers to the collector having a pear orchard by the banks of the Clyde, and more particularly the Gorbals. Who would have thought it? But this refers to the Gorbals across the Clyde, as it was a distinctly different part of Glasgow, but the growth of Glasgow was starting to see it subsume organisations like this. So as we go through the 1800s, the trades gradually moved to becoming completely charitable and social organisations. I was reading some of the minutes and records and correspondence of the dinners in those days. In Trades House, we all know what Trades House dinners are like, and certainly I was a criminal insofar as my dinner overran by 20-25 minutes. But it's worthwhile pointing out that up until World War I, a Trades House dinner could easily have up to 12 courses with 6 different types of wine. And it was quite a sequential operation. Now, in those days, there was 6 postal deliveries a day. Such was the forms of communication that were available, and the fact that Glasgow was growing massively, 500,000 by some estimates by 1891. And 1891, the strength of the Glasgow economy, even though there'd been a cholera epidemic, the Glasgow economy grew even with German unification, the defeat of France in 1871, Crimea. The Glasgow economy rebounded to these things, almost benefited from these things, and it drew in population from the west of Scotland, and the membership did become more cosmopolitan and of wider professions. We start to see in the mid-1800s writers, or WS, writers to the signet, which is an old-fashioned name, I think the clerk will confirm, for lawyers. Interestingly, on the subject of professions, you see things like commercial travellers or mercantile agents, who we might know nowadays better as a salesperson, for example. Some of the phrases that are used, there's a word used in a lot of the minutes, divers, D-I-V-E-R-S, divers, which meant various, but has obviously been consigned to the bin with underwater diving causing confusion. And some of the wording that was used, decayet, for decaying or decrepit, and some of the words were quite, I suppose, old-fashioned. But again, the minutes do set the tone for the confidence that Glasgow had, and the social confidence in particular, because money certainly seemed to be of little object. There is a period in the 1860s after Crimea where there was perhaps uncertainty and economic malaise, but the Hammermen, because they had so much money, they were lending money to the council at an interest rate of 4%. So I'm sure our Chair of Finance, Dean Young, would be over the moon if he could generate a guaranteed rate of return of 4% just now. Certainly I would be. But it's indicative of how strong Glasgow was economically, that those funds were preserved and could be lent out. So yeah, it's an interesting time for Glasgow. Now I suppose the profile and influence of the Hammermen starts to manifest itself in some of the members, because it's around the late 1800s that we start to get some very high profile members joining the Hammermen, such as Henry Campbell Bannerman, who became Prime Minister, Lord Rosebery, who was a Prime Minister. We started to see royalty be sometimes asked to join, sometimes expecting to join, and we start to see some of the captains of industry of the time starting to emerge, like the big shipbuilding families, the Beardmores, the Arrolls, the Burrells. In the 1860s, the McClellans of the McClellan Art Galleries donated those buildings to the city of Glasgow. They were Hammermen deacons, and some of their successors continue in the craft until quite recently. I think it was McClellan as a deacon in the 1980s. So the families have continued to share affinity to the Hammermen, and I think for those of us that are on the Master Court now, that is perhaps best typified by a chap, Douglas Munro Lauder, who somewhat out of left field left us £200,000 in the summer, and none of us, old guard, really knew who he was, but it turned out he'd been schooled in Edinburgh, but his grandfather and father had been members of the Hammermen in the late 1800s. He died leaving no family, was a life rent trust for 20, 30 years, and the money reverted to us. And I think that typifies the trust that our members have in our organisation, because it has existed for 500 years, that we are left these funds to manage and we are trusted. And I think that's an example of the family connection to our ancient craft that I think has value. And obviously one would like to think that that £200,000 will last for many, many years and benefit many, many people. So yes, our charitable aims are obviously well respected. I suppose coming through in history, we start to hear phrases, and I'm thinking of history before World War I, because 1912 is a crucial moment in our history, because it's then that Lumsden, Harry Lumsden, clerk of the Trades House, wrote a very detailed and, how will I put this, objective history of the Hammermen. And the book, which I've got here, if you want to put me on the screen, the book is a substantial volume. It's available free online. It's well out of copyright. The Hammermen, it can be seen, had immersed itself in all strands of social society, not just in Glasgow, but through the UK. And that is, I think, typified by the fact that Prime Ministers had joined the Hammermen, attended the dinner. There's quite an interesting minute that recalls that Master Haldane apologised for missing an important meeting of the Hammermen on account of his being appointed Minister of War. So I think it gives the mutual respect that the members and the organisation had for each other. Now obviously 1912 is perhaps a watershed because it brought our history up to date, but obviously World War I had a major impact, and that these shipbuilding families became not state-owned, rather more the state relied on these large shipbuilding families, and the prodigious output of the Clyde even before World War I, certainly from the 1906 naval war race with Germany, the Clyde was producing over half the ships in the world. And that led Lord Rosebery, Prime Minister, to say, when the hammer is still, the whole of Great Britain has need for apprehension. And that refers to the importance of the Clyde for servicing mercantile marine throughout the empire, importing food, but also the defence of that empire. And of course, by these days, early 1900s, Glasgow was referred to as the second city of the empire. And it certainly was the making of Glasgow as a population centre, obviously eclipsing Edinburgh in the early 1800s. So World War I is probably a moment to, I suppose, savour as being the pinnacle of the Hammermen from its political respect, and there would be reforms again after World War I. There was still the need for ships, but there was obviously the general strike and economic malaise of the 1920s. Now, one might think that Parliament would be rather busy with Reconstruction and Versailles after World War I, unemployment of demobilised soldiers. Not a bit of it. In 1920, we saw the Trades House Order Act having to go through Parliament, making reforms to the voting structures of Trades House. And bear in mind, this was within a year of peace being formally signed off at Versailles. And that goes back to the point I made about the Letter of Gildrey, which still has influence over the governance of Glasgow. To make a change to the Letter of Gildrey requires an Act of Parliament, and that cannot be overdone. The Borough Reform Act was the first big reform when the trading privileges were lost. But to make the bonnet makers and dyers and a few of the more, let's call them the junior crafts, give them more representation, required a change of an Act of Parliament and some other tidying up. So as we get into the sort of 1920s, the general strike, industrial unrest, the need for a welfare state starts to impact on the Hammermen. Now, quite interestingly, 1930, when Sir Ramsay MacDonald took power, is also when Stanley Baldwin became a member, and 3 years before him, a prince became a member. Now, that prince who became a member was to become King Edward VIII of abdication crisis and Mrs. Wallace. So we had an awkward situation whereby we had the Prime Minister of the day, Stanley Baldwin, and the King of the day at odds and the threat of a constitutional crisis. But if we read the minutes of the Hammermen of the time, very measured tones are used of the day and the difficulty of resolving such an issue. One of the common themes we see through the Hammermen minutes is there's almost no interest shown in what the other crafts are doing, but there is interest because of the scale of the Hammermen activity. There is interest in what is going on in global and national politics because it affected the business of the Hammermen, which even in the late 1800s was truly global. So it was quite interesting to see how little of these domestic crises, the general strike, constitutional crisis, even the threat of war, how little it featured compared to potential economic impacts. And money could be found for funding the Trades House battalions, money could be found for funding the move of Glasgow University from the High Street to Gilmore Hill, where it is now. So the Hammermen could find money and would debate issues of strategic importance at some length. And Nina just asked me recently for the Rutherford synopsis of the minutes from 1912 to 1992, which is the sort of last effort, most up-to-date effort of History Out with Our Minutes. And yeah, I find them quite interesting for what they say and for what they don't say, because it's quite a social comment as well as an economic comment of what is going on, not just in Glasgow, but the UK and the world. So, constitutional crisis over, membership still remaining very good, despite it, or perhaps because of it, being a social and charitable organisation. And it's worthwhile saying that obviously dinners, a bit like the current situation, dinners, most of the dinners were suspended during World War II, the blackout, etc. But even once the pent-up demand, which one would be expected from demobilisation, wanted to catch up socially and all the rest of it, it was still the case that dinners had very little interest amongst members in the late 1940s. And our minutes go on about funding food parcels and the food was having to be imported from Canada and Australia. Such was the disruption to the agricultural output of Britain by World War II. So again, even though the welfare state has started to emerge post-World War II, the Hammermen are still very much involved in paying for medical care, pensions, and looking at the minutes, the Rutherford minutes, there could be 70, 80 pensioners on the roll in the 1940s and early 1950s, whereas I think the clerk will correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've got 3 now. So yeah, interesting as our environment changes, we emerge, change our relevance, adapt, whereas perhaps the trade prizes, which refer to students, and the Prince Philip prizes, which started in the 1950s and were rebranded the Hammermen Awards in the 1970s, these awards now number 30, 35 if we include the Scottish Engineering affiliations and other joint awards, the Engineering Professors Council. So from that perspective, the Hammermen has adapted, and I hope certainly that the relevance remains. I suppose, like any organisation, profile is important, and I suppose that has probably led to some of the high-profile members that you see in some of the slides there, such as Sir Billy Connolly. Now, Sir Billy Connolly, that wasn't just a gimmick or a marketing issue. He was a hammerman in the shipyards. Now, my interest in it is that he's actually my wife Gillian's uncle, and although I've rarely ever met him through family connections, but he is proud of being a hammerman, because he is a hammerman and he's very much into Glasgow's history and he's very proud of what Glasgow's achieved. Other high profile.
Sorry to jump in. We're rapidly approaching 7 o'clock, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And I think ending on a famous hammerman, and we'll give 5 minutes opportunity for any questions to have a wee chat on your talk.
Yeah, sure. I'll just wrap up by saying more recently, obviously, the things that have been going through the Master Court are things like obviously student awards, but our Hammerman Service Group, worthwhile pointing out, have been going nearly 50 years. And yeah, we are more inclusive. When I joined, ladies were still not allowed to join, and I've only been a member 20 years. So yeah, I'll just wrap up. Some of the slides there, the artefacts. That young lady in the tartan is holding a Robert Burns pint stoop that was gifted to us 100 years ago by an innkeeper in Trabolton. We have a similar stoop called the Jill Stoop, where we collect money in a form of raffles. Our artefacts, the Langside banners, go back to the Battle of Langside, where we fought on the winning side of Regent Murray, but armed both sides, Mary Queen of Scots. So our history affects so many parts of Glasgow's heritage, and I would like to think that heritage is what has kept us relevant to this day, because there's been 6-7 years I've been on the Master Court, I've been the only non-engineer on it. So
an engineer with numbers.
Well, relevance as well, and I find the heritage of engineering both amusing and sometimes frustrating. The amount of times, Dean, when I was chairing finance and we were going through line by line, £50 here and £100 there, when we had £2 million of funds under management, I used to find that quite interesting. And it was explained to me by Peter McCarthy that engineers have a concept called tolerance. Now, accountants call it materiality. Means there's no point spending money if it's going to cost you more than it's worth. So anyway, I'll finish on that insulting comment to engineers.
Thank you very much, Colin. I think we could afford to put in a part 2 of the history and run it again in April.